This is Build Without Chaos. I'm Colleen Goepfert. One clear idea every episode for operators, founders, and marketers who build with intent. Today, I'm joined by Shannon Nutter, a leader who has built at an impressive scale. From her global leadership roles at Vanguard, where she led a $1 billion launch, to her current work as an advisor and author, Shannon brings both speed and depth to how growth happens. In this conversation, we'll look at what it takes to build at scale, what happens when you pivot into advisory and mentorship, and why stillness might be the most powerful lever leaders overlook. Shannon, welcome to Build Without Chaos. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me, Colleen.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we actually get into your pivot, I'd love for listeners to hear your journey in your own words. What's the through line of your career that brought you from billion-dollar launches to where you are today?
Oh, goodness. How much time do we have? No. I will say that I've always loved creating things. I used to start little businesses as a child. I'm one of those kids that used to run around the neighborhood asking people to buy things from me, which I'm sure the neighbors absolutely loved. And when I graduated from graduate school, my first job was at General Motors. And I worked in future vehicle design. And in that role, I had to go really deep into what the market wanted, what customers needed in whatever the segment was. And then I worked with really disparate teams to bring their vision to life in a way that would meet the needs of the customers. And it was a super entrepreneurial role, even though I wasn't running my own business. And I absolutely loved it. And I think I've been doing that same thing in different ways throughout my entire career, really trying to understand what customers need, designing strategy, leading teams to execute that strategy, and then learning what worked, what didn't work, revising, moving forward. And I have to say, I don't think it's ever gotten old to me.
You mentioned to me that you moved to, I believe, Australia
Yep.
with Vanguard to build out the brand there or the company there. Do you want to expand on that? Because I think that's a really interesting aspect of your career.
Sure. I had been at Vanguard for about 13 years, had led in various roles, and I was offered the chance to go and build a new retirement business. We had a presence there in Australia, and this was a chance to build a completely new retirement business. So think of a 401k business in the States, but in Australia where they call it superannuation. And, I thought, really, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to go and do something like this. Also, once in a lifetime pandemic at the time. I will say that it was an amazing experience to build a team in another country, to get to learn a completely new market.
Absolutely. So at some point, you chose to step out of that position in the operator seat and move into an advisory and mentorship. What told you it was time to make that shift?
I don't know that I did it completely consciously, as in it was planned, completely planned. But when I left Australia at the end of 2023, and I will say that I was pretty exhausted. I was exhausted mentally, I was exhausted physically. I had been away from my family and my friends for 3 years. And so I came back and I really invested in myself. I spent time with family and friends. I traveled. I redecorated my house a little bit so that I hadn't lived in for 3 years. And I listened to a lot of podcasts. I read a bunch of books. I took a class at Stanford. I just did all these things to sort of reinvigorate my own love of learning and start to identify for myself, what is it that really gives me energy and makes me feel excited. And I've always been an advisor and a mentor, in all my corporate roles. And when I got back from Australia, I would say that that didn't change. I had women that reached out to me immediately and said, "Oh, good, you're back in the States. Can I set up some time? Would you be willing to talk to me?" And so I was doing some of that, and I leaned into an organization that I was already a part of and took a more prominent role in advising global CEOs who were starting businesses. And as I did those 2 things, I found that I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the exposure to new industries, to new thinking, to new people, and I enjoyed being able to think as you've described it, right, sort of scale my impact.
Yeah. I imagine those realizations and shifts also shape the perspective you've been bringing
Mm.
into your writing and the interviews that you've been doing with a lot of the different leaders. I'd love to dive into that because you've completed writing a book that draws on hundreds of leaders that you've interviewed. And what's the big question you're trying to answer through that process? And maybe you can also give us a little bit of story around your book.
Yeah. So I think that was one of the discoveries I had when I gave myself some time off the hamster wheel. I think we're so busy so often in operational roles where we're just running from activity to activity that we don't step back and think about what we really want to do and what we really have to contribute. And when I did have that time and space, I ended up meeting another woman, another executive, Julie Carrion, and she and I started having conversations, and we realized we both wanted to write a book and we wanted to say some of the same things. And so we essentially just started to write together and see how that would go. But we came at it from a place of, gee, what do we wish we had known when we started our careers 20 plus years ago? What are all the lessons we've learned, lesson by lesson, one at a time, that, boy, we could save a lot of other women, you know, heartache, turmoil, frustration, whatever that might be, if we could better prepare them for some of the things they're bound to face in corporate America, organizations of all kinds, and not just so that they can understand what they look like, but better prepare and protect themselves in those situations. And as you've mentioned, I started posting some of the things we were writing about on LinkedIn, and a few of the posts just went viral globally. And as a result, I ended up reaching out to over 100 women. Women were reaching out to us. We were reaching out to say, "Hey, can we better understand your story, your perspective, so that we could really compile insights based on women around the world and what they're experiencing in the workplace?"
Wow. Well, I'd love to know what were some of the comments that you were posting that went viral? What really attracted a lot of interest in the different aspects of your book?
The area that we posted about that really seemed to gain a lot of energy, and I'm seeing it more and more actually, which is great because I think ending the silence around it is terrific, was this notion of takedowns, of women who have reached levels in their career, they're very successful, they're powerful, they're having real impact in their companies, and they're high performers. I think that's the part that's, sort of hard to get our heads around. These women are really high performers. And then suddenly they're not valued at their company anymore, and their company pushes them out of leadership and, in fact, pushes them out of the organization. And I think for years and years, these kinds of things have been happening. They are shrouded in NDAs. They're shrouded in silence. I think for a long, long time, they've been shrouded in shame. of women internalizing and saying, I must have done something that I got pushed out. And so people haven't talked about them. And when we started talking about it as, hey, there seems to be this thing that's happening in organizations all over the world. And gee, where is top leadership paying attention to this? Where are boards paying attention to this? Do they even know that it's happening? If they do, why aren't, what are they doing about it? We started to collect stories about exactly this kind of thing, about takedowns that have happened to women all around the world. And we started to pull together, I would say, sort of common attributes. What do women who are taken down look like? How do they perform? What are some of the triggers? How does it happen? And so all of that now has fed into, the manuscript for our book, where we can provide a lot more information to women. And we've posted a lot of it on LinkedIn as well. So women can see if they recognize any of these signs before they're actually pushed out the door.
Wow. I mean, that's deep. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate. What was the reaction when you were talking to some of these people after they told you their story? How were they feeling at the time?
Mm,
How were they reacting? Obviously, they're speaking to you after this happened.
yeah.
So, what was the mind frame they were in at the time, and how were they moving through that?
It's certainly a tough situation, and generally speaking, I would say the women felt like talking about it to me was sort of a therapy. In some cases, these women said, "This is the first time I've told anybody about it, other than maybe my partner or my, close friends because I'm under this NDA. So I haven't mentioned it to anybody." And so being able to talk about it was freeing. I think understanding that they weren't alone in this, that this is just happening everywhere, while that's horrifying on one hand, was very comforting on the other hand for these women, many of whom internalized this as something that they had done wrong. Was like, "Oh, wait a minute. It wasn't just me. It's happening to women all over the place. Oh, okay. Maybe it's the system and it's not actually me." So, well, again, horrible, but that makes me feel a little better as an individual. But, while this sort of behavior is happening in companies, and in our research, it was generally 12 to 24 months before a woman got pushed out the door. That's 12 to 24 months where slowly, like cut by cut, a woman's confidence starts to erode. She starts to question herself. You know, People are getting pushed out of meetings. They're getting pushed out of decisions that they used to make. They their jobs might be changing. All sorts of things might be happening. And women begin to question themselves. So, as you can imagine, during that whole process, there's sort of amping up stress, amping up anxiety, trying to sort out how can I fix this situation if it is my responsibility. And so it's a process that's just sort of wrapped in stress and a feeling of vulnerability. It's just awful.
I want to ask this. You mentioned that these women all have a lot of the same attributes and they're successful at their jobs. Why would they be pushed out?
Mm,
I think if that's something that's even being considered, because in my logical mind, I'm thinking they're doing a great job. How do we retain these people? Right? Isn't that the logical approach? Not how do we push them out?
that that would be logical. And I think that that is where a lot of women mentally struggle with the idea that this may even be happening to them. Because they look and they
Yeah.
say, "But wait, I'm a great performer, and you've always told me, performance equals my standing in the organization," right? I do
Yeah.
a great job, I'm gonna get rewarded for that. And what we've typically found is that these are women who have challenged the status quo in some way, shape, or form. Maybe they have challenged some sort of dynamic in the organization. They've questioned their their pay or their workload or their role. Maybe there's been a big reorganization in the company and now a boss that supported them is no longer in a role, and so you have a different leader coming in. So there's sort of different aspects that can happen, but I will say that the women to a T of everyone we interviewed were strong, confident women. They were not afraid to speak their mind. And so this idea that somehow their strength, their candor, their willingness to call something out in the organization that they didn't think was right put them at risk.
Yeah. I mean, you want to be able to speak your mind in an organization. So it sounds like just a horrible feeling for a lot of these women.
Yeah, I think they felt at the top of their game. So a lot of this comes as then as a surprise, even a bigger shock, I think.
When leaders talk about power, it can sound abstract at times,
Mm.
but the way you've been framing it feels very human.
Hmm.
How do you think leaders can become more aware of these dynamics in real time instead of only seeing them in hindsight?
Of seeing a takedown?
Yeah.
Okay.
What's something that can happen like in the moment
Mm.
with you?
Well, so as we talk about it, we've shared some of this on LinkedIn again, and we'll have it in the book of this notion of, well, if you see a reorg happening in your company, right? That could be a sign that you're at risk. So
Yeah.
pay attention. If you get a new boss, if there's a change in the organizational strategy, if you get layered, right? Something happens to your role or who you
Yeah.
report to. If then if we think about political risk or power dynamics, right? If you disagree with somebody in power, if you challenge the status quo, if you make a decision that somebody doesn't like or hold somebody accountable for their performance and maybe they're a favored employee of someone in power. And then certainly if you question your job, you question your pay. Even women who had performed exceptionally well, had exceeded goals. We had examples of women being called out because somehow they made their peers look bad because they had performed so strongly, and that put them at risk.
I mean, I know so many people now that you and I are talking, like personally, who have been through something like this. I think this is very common at a lot of different companies.
I think it is, and I don't think it's talked about. I mean, I also reflected on my years in various corporate roles and thinking, oh, gee, how many women do I know who retired early or who decided to make a life change or whatever it might be, take a pause, actually were pushed out?
Mm.
And it's a little scary to me to think back that I was maybe so oblivious to this happening. But at the same time, no one was talking about it. Nobody positioned it that way. Those women weren't talking about it. Those women certainly weren't reaching down the ranks and saying, "Oh, by the way, just FYI."
Yeah.
Big
Yeah.
warning flag to all you other women. And so, that really was part of the impetus of us writing this book, was to give those forewarnings to people, not just about takedowns, but about other things you're going to run into in the workplace.
So I guess for anyone listening, what advice and maybe they're feeling like Man, I'm in the middle of this. I'm really happy I've tuned into this episode of Build Without Chaos because I'm in the thick of this. What is some advice you could give? Something that you've seen?
I mean, if you are listening to this and you say, "Oh shoot, I think I'm in the midst of a takedown. I think this is actually happening to me." One, you can go read more about it on some of our posts to try to confirm that. But two, document what's happening to you. Document the timeline of when these things have occurred. Speak to a lawyer or an employee advocate. Understand what your options are. And then I think you are in a little bit better of a position should the company suddenly decide to lay you off or fire you or whatever they plan to do there, to be in a position of power when you negotiate a severance, right? A lot of women actually don't negotiate severance, and they take whatever is offered for them, and in many, many cases, they could do a lot better. And I think then there's also the aspect of how is your mental health? You know, should you go see a therapist? Take care of yourself. This is stressful.
Yeah.
Being in this kind of situation is really stressful. So, taking care of your mental and your physical health, reaching out to somebody else that you might know has gone through this, reaching out to somebody in your company that left early and asking whether this happened to them. Get advice if you can. Some of those people may even have suggestions for legal counsel. I think there is value in speaking about it, although you obviously have to be careful of who you trust within the organization because you don't really know necessarily who's.
Yeah. I think that's great advice. I'm thinking about just different situations I've had in my career. And what I will say is it feels really dark in the moment, but in a way, you take the idea of if you don't want to work with me, no problem. This is a business transaction. I will leave and I'll find something better. I know it's heavy and I know that there's a lot of mental health attached to this too. And I don't want to diminish that. But I think also realizing that you can pivot yourself out of this too by exploring new opportunities and new cultures and environments that are going to be better supportive for you and who you are as a person. Has that ever come up in any discussion that you've had?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that the one of the challenges or something we've consistently heard from women is that they've put themselves into their jobs like 150%. And their self identity, to a certain extent, is just tangled up with their role. I mean, successful, high powered women, right? It's not necessarily surprising. But I think many of these women, as they've moved away from these roles because of this situation, have said, wait a second, I am never going to do that again. That wasn't healthy for me. Yes, I want to be amazing at my job. I want to give it 100%, but I don't need to give it 150% of myself. I
Yes.
don't need to give it 200% of myself. And in fact, my own personal value is not my job title. It's not the power I wield in my organization, and it's not my paycheck. I'm valuable as
Mm.
a person because of who I am. And so being able to separate those things, I think, is an outcome that a lot of women have learned that, in my own personal view, is super, super healthy.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I want to shift out of talking about your book and into the arc that you took, which was moving from the very high powered role you were in and leaving more of a legacy behind by writing a book and mentorship. For leaders who want to experiment with a shift like that, but feel uneasy stepping back, or really not sure what path to go forward with that, what's one practical way they can start creating more space without losing any sort of relevance
Mm.
that they're maybe had with a title?
Well, I think you described it well there with you've got to make some space. I do think you need some level of silence for self reflection and
Yeah.
to be able to think about, okay, I have this job over here. Let's just say you still have a role, full-time role, but to be able to think about what really matters to me. What kind of influence or impact do I actually want to have? And in what kind of space? It doesn't necessarily have to be anything in your quote workspace, right? I've known people that have said, "Oh, I actually want to now have an impact in government or nonprofit or climate change or education or whatever it is." But they've needed some time to say, "Oh, actually that really matters to me." And if I had time and energy to devote to something else to have an impact, that's what I want it to be. So I do think you need some silence, some time to really talk to yourself and listen to yourself, maybe more importantly.
Yeah. No, I think that's really great because you're bringing a different perspective in from all of these different interviews you've done, which is the overperforming, executing leader who maybe had to take a shift down, not on their own will, but now realizing that there's more to life than actually working at that level and executing at that level. And what does that mean? And to tie it back to you, that's essentially what you've done in terms of writing this book and leaving this legacy behind and having this creative project. I mean, we started off this conversation with you saying you were always a creative person. So it's really, I think, finding what it is that you like to do and resurfacing that at any age.
Yeah, and I think that we often lose touch with that
Yeah.
because you are so busy down in the trees, right, that you don't see the forest.
Yep.
And you forget that there are parts of the forest that maybe you haven't explored for a while and that you really enjoy and that give you a lot of energy or meaning. And so how do you rediscover that and allow yourself to go there? I think, someone quoted to me, and I need to find the original quote, but somebody said to me last year, anytime you go and start something new, it takes you 5 years to become a queen in that space. And I just love
Well,
that notion that it's like, oh yeah, why would any of us expect that we're going to be amazing at something new overnight? But give yourself that time to go explore it, to start to dip your toe in, see if you like it, and then continue to hone it in whatever way makes sense.
and I think that's part of the fun, right? Becoming good, taking the 5 years to become good. If we were great at everything off the bat,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be so much fun.
Well, I think any of us can look back. I mean, my 22-year-old self coming out of college would have never predicted what I was doing at age 40 or what I'm doing at age 50, right? You just couldn't have seen it. And if you had seen it, I don't know. I just don't know that you would have believed it. Right? So,
True.
you take these sort of meandering paths and it can make sense in retrospect, but you would have never predicted it forward from your earlier years.
Absolutely. If you were to tell me 2 years ago I'd be hosting a podcast called Build Without Chaos, I don't think I would have believed you. So, I completely get it. One final question to close out for you, and it's expanding on what you just
Mhm.
said. So, if you could go back to your 22-year-old self, what's one piece of wisdom about your career or just where you're going that you would share with that
Mhm.
22-year-old self?
You know, I have long said one of the greatest pieces of advice I got at the time was you don't get what you don't ask for, right? So be bold and ask for the opportunities you want. But I have to say, having done so much work in the past year and talked to so many women, I think I would tell myself to lean on other women more, to support other women more,
Yeah.
and to approach the world with more of an abundance mindset. I think so much of what we do as leaders, as people who are striving to be great in whatever field we are, is this sort of scarcity mindset of like, well, if I'm going to succeed, then you're probably not going to succeed quite as much as me.
Right.
So, and I don't believe that's true. And I find that for me personally, the more that I approach the world with an abundance mindset of, Colleen, you can be amazingly successful, and I can also be amazingly successful. And we could even do that in exactly the same field. And your success does not hinder my success at all. In fact, we could help each other if we chose to. I mean, I think just the more I approach the world from that mindset, the happier I've been.
Isn't that what we're all doing here? I mean, shouldn't we be helping each other out and lifting each other up, especially in the world that we live in today? Everything's so chaotic out there. Maybe we should just be helping each other out a little bit more. I will tell you that's a definite focus of myself, and I'm happy to hear it from you as well, Shannon. This has been a wonderful conversation. I am so thrilled you could join me today. For anyone listening that wants to know more about how to get your book or when it's going to come out, do you have any details to share, or should they just reach out to you on LinkedIn, or where are you at with that?
Well, we have been talking to a publisher and we should have some news relatively soon to announce. So
Great.
keep an eye on LinkedIn and we'll share it when we can.
Great. We will do. And I will definitely be looking for that LinkedIn post myself because I'm excited to read it.
Great.
Thanks again. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, Colleen.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Build Without Chaos. If today's episode resonated, subscribe and share it with someone else who's building without chaos.